you know, it's hard to explain unless you've been there, but there's just one way of being there, and it's you let your guard down 1 minute, you're dead, or kicked, or beaten. If you're a woman, you're raped. Literally, if you're a woman, you cannot. If you're a woman on the street, I don't care how you got there, there's no way you are not going to be raped, sexually abused of one way or another. Just no way.
You know, you can become very depressed or mentally ill from violence, but then that actually can reduce your ability to break free.
PTSD, there's about 65% of the women in our study have PTSD, about 75% have severe depression.
So that's a higher rate than soldiers returning from Iraq.
It is. Isn't it about 15% for people who have been in combat, and we have about 65% in our population. Interestingly enough, when we were following all HIV positive men and women, we found that it was probably about 35 to 40%. And now when we're looking at only women, HIV positive, HIV negative, it's 65. It's much higher when we're only looking at women.
Yeah.
Rape, and coming from a background where at one time I could have done something about that, when you're on the street, you go, get out of here. And I'm not talking about rape where there's an argument like between one man and one woman. I'm talking about 3 or 4 guys just using a woman, and I mean, like that. And it was like, whoa, scary. And like 2 guys would watch while one guy did it, and then they take turns like that, and that was horrible. And then at Polk Street, watching the kids, watching young boys hustle in, you know. I lived at what they used to call piss in the sink hotels when I could get enough money to get in those down there. And in the dining room fights, just break out, fights break out, stealing shit. I've been beat myself. I was beat up. Someone, because I tried to protect a half a bottle of wine I had. And then the guy hit me on the side of the head. I don't even remember anything after that. I remember I know one of my ribs was broken one time because I woke up and it was months before it started to go away. I guess it healed. Fighting is not. You see fights on TV, even these martial arts guys. It's nothing like that. People bite, scratch. I've seen a guy lose his eye in a fight like that. I've seen long before the Mike Tyson thing. I saw a guy get bited with his ear, got bitten off. Not even the other guy didn't even feel it. I mean, I've seen people walking around with blood soaked all down their sides and stuff. And you know the most horrible part now that I think about it was I was numb to it. I had no feelings about that. You know, it was like, okay, well, here we are. This is part of my. That's what I mean about not seeing the other world, the world where, especially when I was in the cities, the other world was like a dream. It was like watching TV, maybe. You know, it was there. I can remember guys in suits walking up and down the street, but it had nothing to do with me. You know, I don't see you. I mean, I literally only see the other people where I am. I don't see them because they don't see me. And after a while, you get numb to it. It was just numb. I remember that. I can remember that feeling like it was yesterday.
There's a really complicated mix between domestic violence and substance use, in which people get so discouraged from the violence that they'll actually start using substances. And so sometimes people get hooked on drugs that they're also reliant on their partner for. So they'll get caught up in a very vicious cycle of homelessness, violence, and drugs that make it just all the harder for them to have a stable existence.
You can't avoid it. I mean, the streets are so full of drugs and alcohol. And I'm not talking about good drugs or good alcohol. I'm not talking about cocaine. I'm talking about crack. I'm talking about cheap wine. Even drug users eventually start using alcohol because they have to take the edge off when they can't get their fix. It's tough to support a habit on the streets. You're pushed into it. Everybody around you starts to do it. You cannot be on the streets without eventually tapping into some form of substance abuse. How do you live? I said it before when I was talking about me, that I had the artificial high at least, whereas people who come on the street, so they got to get into it. You can't be there all the time. You can't face it without some sort of chemical in you to make you, so you don't feel. You don't feel. That's the big. You learn that if there's one thing I know about the streets, it teaches you how not to feel. None of us on the streets felt anything.
What happens is you have to develop new coping skills to live on the street or to be in unsafe situations, right? You have to learn to get tougher, probably. You gotta learn how to manipulate to get yourself in and out of situations. You may need to steal to get food. You may need to use drugs to cope or drink to cope. And likely if you landed on the streets and you don't have another option, there's a whole host, there's a story behind that, right? There was childhood abuse and neglect, or there was community violence, or you got assaulted or raped or beaten or hurt or scared.
We used to call them straights. You're straight. What are you doing on the street? You're straight. Because when I was on the streets and people would get there because of economic reasons or whatever, I didn't understand it. I could understand that, but they would eventually. What other answer is there besides outright suicide? And there were plenty of those.
So that becomes, right, like now you're used to living afraid, or you are constantly having to watch yourself everywhere you go. So when you get into housing, it doesn't like reset back to a time when you felt safe and reset all of that, right? You still have lots of fears and unknowns, and you don't know who to trust, or you have only your friends on the street that you can trust, and you're housed and they're not, so now you got a bunch of guilt. And you still may not have the skills. Did you finish high school? Did you go to college? Do you know where your social security card is? Do you know, do you know how to clean a house? Do you know where to go to get groceries? Do you know how to budget your money? Like, those things don't happen overnight and just by virtue of walking into a house. And it may feel pretty overwhelming to be in a brand new environment, and it might feel lonely.
The women that we work with articulate it in that way as well. They're very clear about there's not a sense of fatalism nor lack of responsibility for their behavior, but there can be a really clear sense of constraint and a real need and want for a way to lift those constraints so that the choices broaden.
And to give one example, a quantitative example, a few years ago we published a study that showed the strongest correlate of incarceration for women in our study was homelessness. It was not drug use, it was not sex work, it was homelessness. And so yes, the individual behavior is what brought that woman to become incarcerated, but what our data suggests is that that's happening in the context of homelessness. So homelessness is obviously influencing these decisions.
What got folks here is that we've failed families, and we've failed educationally, and we failed to provide the supports to people to prevent childhood abuse and violence and domestic violence and mental health and substance abuse issues and all of those things, and poverty, and untreated and lack of interventions and a failure to address that will always give us a significant population of homeless youth and homeless adults. It's just no other way.